to the special edition of the Casser-Jayne Show. I am Casser-Jayne. Several years ago, John Holt read the astonishing memoir of Holocaust survivor Marion Blumenthal Lazan, FOUR PERFECT PEBBLES. It inspired him to write a 2-act musical about her Holocaust experiences, the title song aptly named FOUR PERFECT PEBBLES. It is sung by then 11-year-old Lyric Ackelson. You'll hear more of Holt's song throughout this broadcast. But first, more about Marion Blumenthal Lazan. Holocaust survivor Marion Blumenthal Lazan is testament that out of hell can be born an angel. Marion Blumenthal Lazan is living history. She's one of the last survivors of the Holocaust. Her story, the subject of her unforgettable memoir, FOUR PERFECT PEBBLES, A Holocaust Story. Marion's story begins in Germany in the early 1930s. Following Hitler's rise to power, the Blumenthal family, father, mother, Marion, and her brother Albert, were trapped in Nazi Germany. They managed eventually to make their way to Holland, but soon Holland was occupied by the Nazis. For the next 6.5 years, the Blumenthals were forced to live in refugee, transit, and death camps that included Westerbork in Holland and the notorious Bergen-Belsen in Germany. From the events preceding Kristallnacht to imprisonment in concentration camps, to liberation in April of 1945, to her surviving family's ultimate relocation to the United States, and her subsequent years, Marion's story is one of horror and hardship, but it is also a story of courage, hope, the will to survive, and a commitment that the world never forget. My conversation with Marion Blumenthal Lazan begins now. So Marion, first of all, thank you so much for being here. Your story begins in the early 1930s with the rise of Hitler. Tell us about your family. What kind of life were you living in Germany prior to the rise of Hitler?
My parents, my father, my brother, 2-year older brother, and I lived very comfortably in a small town called Hoya near the city of Hanover in Germany. And life for our family was very much the way it is here for most people. And it was 1935. I mean, we were comfortable. My father was in a very successful shoe business, and we did live with my grandparents above the shoe store. And the Nuremberg laws came about in 1935. And the following are some of the many, many restrictions imposed on the Jewish people pertaining to the Nuremberg laws.
Okay, tell us a little bit about them, because I don't think everybody knows what the Nuremberg laws are or were.
The Nuremberg laws were, again, it was in 1935 when the guy with the mustache came along and decided to put restrictions on Jewish people in Germany. And some of the restrictions, they all pertain to Jewish people. Of course, they were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on, and it was then that my parents decided to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, could not comprehend and understand why they should leave. They were elderly. They were in their 70s, which at that time was elderly, and they were also sickly, and they couldn't leave. We couldn't leave them. And when they passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other, it was then that my parents made arrangements for us to leave the country.
Well, there's the Kristallnacht, too, the Night of Broken Glass. Tell us about that.
Okay. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. It's when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was definitely the beginning of the Holocaust. It was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews of Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. And yes, in reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. And what is so remarkable and chutzpahdik, or never mind, is that on November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. And these imposed taxes were used, of course, to rearm Germany. I mean, it's just
bizarre, because that's the only way. Beyond bizarre.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something else because I think this is something that I am asked a lot of. I'm Jewish. I haven't lost family in the Holocaust, obviously. And people always say to me, why didn't they leave earlier? Why didn't people get it? Why did they stay? I think you touched on that with your grandparents. Their roots are there.
Right. Well, first of all, in our case, we couldn't leave because we had our grandparents, and we would not leave them. Some of our people did leave. They saw the writing on the wall, and they did leave. Those who lived in bigger cities like Berlin and Hamburg and Frankfurt and so on, they saw it even more so than we who lived in a very small town. And those in big cities, for the most part, if they were wise enough or understood or realized, decided to pick up and leave. And they left, for the most part, left on time. And of course, for us, that was not the case.
Here's something that's also strange. Your dad served in World War I for Germany.
Yeah, not only that, he received the Iron Cross for his exemplary service in the German army of World War I. He was awarded the Iron Cross, which was a very high honor at that time. And a few years later, they locked him up because after Kristallnacht, during that time, my father was taken away from our home. And unbeknownst to my mother, was sent to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. He never spoke about his time in that camp. And he was let go after about 3 weeks, only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. At that time, they were perfectly willing to let us go, but it was very shortly thereafter that they got hold of us.
And then you leave. You head out. You're right. Let's go to Holland. You get papers. Your family goes to Holland.
All right. We had our papers. We had the passage was paid for. We had our affidavit. That is a document so that we would not be a burden to the government. That was in place. The visa everything was in place. And so it was in December of 1939 that we really was, even before that we decided to, after Kristallnacht, after my father was released from Buchenwald, that we went to Holland in order to emigrate to the United States. And for 9 months, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children in Holland while we were waiting for our quota number from the American State Department. That's the only document that was not intact, okay? And in December of 1939, we were, at that time, deported to a detention camp which was named Westerbork in Holland. It was just the northern part of the country, and to await our departure date to America. And Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. And it was May 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, that the Germans invaded Holland, and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were already on board ship, were burnt and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam in Holland was bombed. So there we were, caught up with all that.
Let me ask you about this, because this is a question that I was curious about. This detention camp, what is that? That's, you have to.
It was a transit camp. That's where we were all placed. Mainly, Hallie, because Holland is a very small country. Thousands of our people went to Holland with the intentions of fleeing Germany or fleeing Europe at that time. And it's a little bit of a country. The Dutch were afraid. First of all, there was no housing for us. Second of all, they were afraid that our people would take jobs, which were also, I guess, already at that time difficult to come by. So they put us in this detention camp, a transit camp. And it was fine. Under Dutch control, it was fine. And we had a makeshift education. My parents did some menial work. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and, of course, lived a very dull, stagnant life. And it was several months later,
the Nazis,
1940, when the Germans invaded Holland, and we were trapped.
How old were you at this time?
At that time, I was 5.
And do you remember specifics of this at this point?
Very faint at that time. If you notice, I don't know if you read the book or you have the book, it is written in the third person to begin with, because much was told to me. There's no way that a 4 or 5-year-old can remember details. So therefore the book was written in the third person. It was later on, you'll see that you certainly remember at the age of 8, 9, and 10 particular, when it's such a traumatic experience.
Well, that's not to say that what you were going through at 4 and 5 didn't impress upon your DNA. I always say
100%, but I was so lucky, so fortunate to have been so very young, and that I was always with my mother.
Right.
Tremendous inner strength, tremendous fortitude, an amazing, amazing lady.
We're going to talk about her in a little bit. So the Nazis now have taken over, and you're in the detention camp, and now they start transporting the Jews to extermination camps.
So once the German SS took over the command of Westerbork, it was then that we became acquainted with the barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family. She was in the same camps I was in. It was at that time that Westerbork became overcrowded, and we had to share at that time our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. And this started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, and that caused incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday morning, men, women, and children were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. And this area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. And it was at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning, almost like clockwork. The trains left for their destination. And listen to this, of the total 120,000 men, women, and children who departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return.
Oh my gosh.
So it was, and very interesting, mentioning the 102,000. My book, FOUR PERFECT PEBBLES, it's in German, it's in Dutch, it's in Japanese, it's in Hebrew. And the Dutch, very interesting, the Dutch publisher decided to publish first printing 102,000 copies.
Oh my gosh.
In memory of the 102,000 Dutch Jews that never returned.
Wow. Isn't that something?
That's a really interesting,
emotional. So now you are, you and your mom and your brother and your dad are sent to Bergen-Belsen.
Well, it was January 1944 that it was our turn to be shipped out, and adults suspected and somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember when we approached the railroad platform, we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel. And of course, fear began to mount. And we children were very naive, and we actually welcomed the move. But adults already knew what was in store for us. And I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch-black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. And we were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards, who were shouting at us and threatening us with their rifles and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. At that time, I was a very frightened 9-year-old. And actually, to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Now, I know that German Shepherds can be wonderful pets, but they can be trained to be vicious attack dogs, and that's what they did.
The conditions on the train, were they just horrendous, or?
Well, at that point, the train from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen was not as terrible. It was, I don't even know how long it really took, but there were some passenger trains, there were some cattle cars, and the worst train ride was after we left Bergen-Belsen.
Right, we're going to talk about that
later. Yeah.
So talk to me about this. This is something that I've been dying to. She and I met a couple of 2 weeks ago. I guess you were at my temple in Vero Beach. You were sent to Bergen-Belsen. You have these pictures in your mind. I have to ask you, when you look back at all of this, Marion, do you see it in black and white or in color?
Black and white. No one has ever asked me that.
Yeah.
But I can tell you right now, there was no color.
I think that's
I never even thought of that. But I can answer that. I answered it immediately.
Yeah, I was thinking about that for 2 weeks. I just could tell by the way.
Let me make a note of what you just asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have chills because I've been dying to ask you about that because I could tell from the way that you were telling the story that that's how you saw it. And that tells me a couple of things. It tells me, because I think fear does that to people. Fear takes dimension out of one.
You know, you talk about fear, Hallie. I'm often asked what is the worst thing for me to have dealt with during that miserable childhood. We were 6.5 years in various camp situations. For me, personally, the worst thing to have dealt with at that time was to deal with the emotion of fear. I was always afraid of what would happen to us next, afraid of who would die next. Would my mother come back from her work duties? That was the worst. But that was Bergen-Belsen. That wasn't Westerbork. Westerbork was, as far as I'm concerned, okay. Awful for parents, because they knew what was ahead of them, because there were always people who came back with news and so on. But I, as a child, Westerbork was okay. But once we got to Bergen-Belsen, that fear factor was paramount within me.
How do you survive? I mean, 5 minutes of fear send most of us into crazy, right? We all do whatever we can to get out of fear, because fear is just horrible. So can you get used to living with fear? Does it take a place, kind of putting it in a pocket and just say, okay, it's there, I'm going to carry it around, but I'm...
No. It was renewed over and over again because there were so many different situations on a daily basis. People died. The situation in Bergen-Belsen was... There are no pictures and there are no words that can actually describe the horror of Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah, black and white, that does it.
It was, oh my goodness, yeah. That camp was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire, double rows of 6-foot-high barbed wire, or beyond 6 feet. And guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers. And in the evening, as soon as it would turn dark, those bright searchlights would constantly sweep the campgrounds. And we were placed, I don't know if you want to know all this.
Yes, I do.
But we were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star, which had been issued to us back in Holland. And we were placed in this particular section with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine. And unfortunately, this hope never materialized for our family. Men were on one side of the camp, the women on the other, and this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another.
Mother comforts Albert and me, Father shields us from misery. No parent's love can ever erase this sad and forgotten lonely place. 600 of us. 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks meant for 100 when originally built. And there were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold, and they still are, and very long. We were only given 1 thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress, and this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother, and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you possibly imagine 2 adults, 2 strangers, sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions, a bunk that was no larger than the little cot bed that we're all so familiar with.
It's unfathomable to me, right?
Yeah, unbelievable. Yeah. Of course.
And I can't imagine, with the fear that you all had, because everybody in that place had the same amount of fear, and the noises and the terror that would come at night, and hearing a 9-year-old girl hearing things that you shouldn't be hearing, seeing things that you shouldn't be seeing.
We couldn't wait for the nights to be over because of the way you described it. Yes, the noises and the moaning and the groaning and people dying.
Right.
And we couldn't wait for the days to be over because we were cold, we were hungry, we were in pain. We had to stand out there on a rappel for all day at times, where they would count us. Had to stand there 5 in a row.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. Let me first get to this, because you saw a wagon.
I remember the first time seeing a wagon, and I thought surely that was firewood for the small oven we had in our barrack. That oven definitely was never used. And of course, I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. I thought it was wood. And toilets and washing facilities in Bergen-Belsen were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was never any privacy. There was no toilet paper. There was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost a year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. And of course there were no flowers, and there were no trees and no grass, and whenever it rained we had to slush through the mud, and that added even more misery to our already dismal existence.
It was a horror. But it's interesting to me because one of the clues was when you said about me understanding that you saw this in black and white, is when you said that there were no flowers, there were no trees, there was no green, there was nothing. There was
nothing even to remind us that there was such a thing.
Exactly. There's no dimension. They've completely stripped dimension from life. Tell us about that morning lineup, because this to me, when you talk to me.
I mean, every morning, every single morning. I mean, it was so absolutely ridiculous. We would have to stand on a pell. We had to stand in a huge field called an Appellplatz. It was every morning without fail. And there we had to stand 5 in a row as we were counted. And it made no sense because people died all the time. They were sick and couldn't move. It didn't matter. We had to stand there sometimes all day, and without food, without water, and without protective clothing. And frostbite was common in all kinds of weather.
Talk about the frostbite.
Well, we had no protective clothing, and frostbite was common, and we would treat our affected toes and fingers actually with the warmth of our own urine. That's the only warmth that we ever had while we were in the camps. And that's how we warmed our extremities, particularly when there was frostbite. Many of our people suffer from damaged feet because of that, because of standing there all day. And then they had those terrible marches, death marches they called, in all kinds of weather. But that didn't pertain to us. We did not do that. The food was beyond. I mean, our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, sometimes a pat of butter, and some hot watery soup that contained pieces of grizzly meat and potato peel and turnips. And that bread was later cut back and given to us once a week. And only if our so-called quarters, I mean, those quarters were just, those triple-decker bunk beds, and were straw as a mattress, straw mattresses. But the bed had to be in perfect condition. Otherwise, they would not give us that one ration of bread.
Talk to me about this. Talk to me about the guards. I want to suggest this. People like me, we only know this from family who's gone through it, friends like you who've gone through it. I hope you're my friend now.
For sure.
Okay. And
for sure.
That's all we know, or we know it from film. Hear me. So that when we see films, after a while, you might even say to yourself, oh, come on, they're overdoing this.
Mm-hmm.
Achtung.
That is the danger.
I want to talk to you about that.
That's why we're running as fast as we can, as long as we're able. We, meaning my husband, Nathaniel, please God, will be married 64 years in August. Okay. But
and he's handsome as the day is long. Both of them are.
It wouldn't work without him because he's the computer guy. I don't do that. So that's the truth. Everything is with technology today,
I know.
So,
here we are.
He's very good with this thing.
But I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the German guards. They were as horrible.
Oh, my God. Well, once a month, they actually march us to an area to shower. And there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. And, of course, we had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe. And we, therefore, were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. Another fear tactics. And the Nazis, they did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, emotionally, and in many, many, many cases they succeeded. And it was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible.
Right.
But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose.
Sure.
And the failure of their attempts were obvious. And we actually did see when we saw their bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. So it's just remarkable how they had no heart, no soul, and these men and women went home to their own families, Hallie, at night as though they had a 9-to-5 job.
Unfathomable. And
Germany at that time was one of the most cultured nations in the world.
Right. That's what makes it even more hard to believe that this happened there.
Brilliant people.
Right. You're one of them.
Mentality will never understand.
Yeah. See, I think that's something worth talking about briefly, which is the incomprehension of it, because it's how many years later, and I know that when you're talking to the audience, but you're talking to yourself too. It's unfathomable, and I don't know what people do when you reach such a point in life where
that's why, first of all, I'm often said, when did you start talking about this? It took us about 30 years before we could open up and talk about it. First of all, we needed to put it aside so we could go on with our lives. And a close second is we didn't think that anyone would believe us anyway, just the way you just said it.
Right.
You know, I mean, unbelievable.
You know,
your
son
do this to one another.
I don't know if you know this, but right. I was talking to your son, and he said to me, you know, I never knew about this. Growing up, we didn't know. She didn't talk to us until later about it. Mm-hmm. I said, wow. That's amazing. But I understand why. You had to process it too. A lot to process.
They did hear about in bits and pieces, especially when they didn't eat their meals or when they wanted to throw it out. They didn't dare. And to this day, they don't throw out food. And it's always Safta will eat it. Don't worry. Safta is grandma in Hebrew.
Right.
I'm the Safta. My husband is a Saba for grandfather. Okay. And not to worry, you know, I'm going to throw it out. Safta will eat it. And I will, you know, got fat from shame. Shame to throw this out and shame to throw that out. Early on, they learned not to throw food out. And then I told them bit by bit as I got older why that was so important to me.
You're a lucky lady because you have a great husband. I did talk to him at great length. You know, he's cute
he's amazing.
He's handsome too. I wasn't kidding. What a handsome you both are. You're beautiful people. I mean, it's like Barbie and Ken. But that being said, we put that aside for a second. I imagine, and we'll get to how you guys met in a bit, but while I'm thinking about it, let's go to this, which is I imagine that what happened to you comes out in odd ways in who you are, how you act, how you respond to certain things. And I imagine that was true then, and I imagine that's true now. He must have been a really terrific guy and stood by you 100% through all the emotional, you know, carousels that you've probably had to swing through in your life in dealing with this, because I'm sure it never goes away. Never.
No, there's always something that reminds me of what happened then. Always something. For instance, a number of years ago, I needed surgery on my face. Something needed to be cauterized. Something that had to be burned away. And as soon as the surgeon began with that procedure, I told him to stop. And after I explained to him that the smell of the burning flesh reminded me of my years in the camps.
Oh, God.
And after I had a drink of water, I permitted him to continue. And then, of course, there are times I do my grocery shopping. The bill comes to $19.43. Hallie, the checkout clerk, will hear me say 1943 was a terrible year. And they look at me.
Right.
And I get a brief explanation, not as lengthy as you had gotten it from me so far, but they get to hear it, why 1943 was so terrible. And then at times the bill comes to $19.53. They'll hear me say that 1953 was the best year of my life. That's the year Nathaniel and I got married. So when I say that to the students,
just amazing.
Nice.
That's just great. That's just great.
Nice.
So let's go back. It's funny because odor was on my list of things that I wanted to but I think you just answered that. We can go past that because obviously
everyone has heard about the Holocaust, and many have seen movies and true documentaries about that subject. But the constant foul odor and the filth, continuous horror, and yes, fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. No doubt. There is no way. We were covered with lice.
Yes,
there was a distinct difference between head lice and closed lice. And actually squashing them between my thumbnails, that became my primary pastime. And then, of course, you want to hear about my 4 pebbles.
Yes.
Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games. And one game in particular, based on, I guess, superstition, became particularly important to me. I decided that if I were to find 4 pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the 4 members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find that 3rd or 4th pebble? Might that mean that 1 or 2 of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope.
4 perfect pebbles do I see, 1 for each member of my family. I hold them tight, I will not cry. All will live, no one will die.
And when Lila Pearl heard me speak about the 4 pebbles, Lila Pearl is the co-author of my memoir, 4 Perfect Pebbles. When she heard, and actually my book was the 50th book that she had published under her name, but this was the first one and only one that she wrote with someone who was living. So it was a very challenging time for her because everything had to be 100% correct, and she couldn't just put things in there that weren't so. On the way home, after hearing the presentation, I spoke at that time here in New York to middle school students, and she saw the reaction of the students, and she then asked whether they would work with her to put the story into book form. And again, with the help of my mother and my brother, the manuscript was completed in a year and a half, and it was, Hallie, 1 rejection and then immediately accepted by HarperCollins, Green Willow division of HarperCollins. And she, on her way home, already knew the title of the memoir, 4 Perfect Pebbles, and she already formulated the chapters.
It's a great book.
The way the story is told.
Yeah, it's just wonderful book. It's phenomenal.
Well, it's a good teaching tool as well for young people.
But it's well written. It's well written. It's beautifully written.
It has the history of the Second World War woven in with my story.
Exactly.
So it's a human interest story, and somehow it works. Yep.
When we talk about the 4 Pebbles and the game that you play, what came to my mind beyond that, and you mention it a little bit, and that is, thank God for the human imagination.
Exactly.
You know, and I was thinking about this too, because, you know, they're trying to cut the funding for PBS and for the arts, and I'm freaking out about that, okay? Because to me, being an artist type, you know, what's more powerful? What engages children?
Exactly.
What grows children's minds more?
Oh my goodness!
More
what
than
damage they're going to do if that's what
okay. Well, they already do, because they've cut it out of schools because it's always the first thing to go, and I think we all have to fight that, and I rage on about that all the time. That being said, you use that imagination not just in the game of the 4 Pebbles, because but tell us about your imaginary friends.
First of all, I was 9 and 10 years old when things were at its absolute worst. We had nothing to occupy our time with constructively. There was no paper, there was no pencil, no books, and definitely no games. So therefore, I was particularly lucky that I had such an imaginative mind, and my imaginative games were always based on a positive attitude. For instance, I would search for a piece of glass or a piece of a mirror, whatever I could find on that really dirty ground, filthy ground in Bergen-Belsen. And when the sun would shine, and I, Marion, knew that sun would always come out. And when it did, that little piece of glass would cast a reflection onto the ground, and that little wiggly reflection, it became my pet. As long as the sun would shine, I would have my pet, and my pet would never ever die. I would also imagine, I had all kinds of games that I played. I wished I had shared them with my friends, but I didn't. They might have thought of me silly. Nobody wants to be thought of as being silly. So I would imagine that someday I once again would have my 3 Bs. And these 3 Bs represent our everyday comforts and necessities that we all take so much for granted. And these Bs, okay, the first B would be a bed. I knew that someday I once again would have my very own bed with the real mattress, clean sheets, and enough blankets to keep me warm. And the second B represented a bath. Warm water, soap, clean towel, and with that would come toothpaste and a toothbrush, of course. And the third B was bread. I knew that someday I once again would have enough bread so that I would never again go hungry. First of all, in German, it is also these 3 items start with a B. So it is ein Bett, ein Bad, und Brot. That's the German, okay? And these imaginary games, if you will, they were my survival skills. They were my survival techniques. And as you heard me say when I spoke in Vero Beach, we all have survival techniques and skills within us. When the need arises, we just have to search for them, find them, and be sure that we put them to work. Because no one is spared adversity. No one is spared hardship. We all have to overcome obstacles at one time or another. But with perseverance, determination, faith, and hope, we can overcome just about anything and everything. We have to be careful how we say that, because not everything can be overcome. But we have to work on it.
I'm going to pivot, but it's not a pivot. I want to talk about your mom. Your mom lived to be 105, I think you told me.
6 weeks short of 105.
Unbelievable. But what a woman she must have been. First of all, she produced you, and I'm kind of like in love with who you are. That being said, you talk about her and you talk about the women and how important they were to survival for families in the camp. And I know your brother and your father were in a different place. Thank gosh they were together. That was a good thing.
Yeah, but they suffered much more than we did.
Yes, and we'll talk about that. I know that you'll want to talk about your brother in a bit and your dad, but your mom. Let's do a send up to your mom, because that imagination that you have, that chutzpah that you have, that ability to endure and to thrive, not just survive. You thrived. I know that had to come from Mom.
100%. And people died. Teenagers and men suffered most, and they were the first to die. But those who lasted the longest, were the women, and mothers in particular, because it was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And yes, my mother is one of those remarkable ladies. There is just no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and her fortitude that saw us through.
Well,
no doubt.
Yeah. So, can you remember?
Physically, we were done. We were finished physically. I mean, I weighed 35 pounds, 16 kilos when we were liberated. My mom weighed barely 70 pounds.
Unbelievable.
So physically, we were done. It was only what's between the ears
that could keep you alive.
The mindset, the will that kept us going.
Can you remember her holding you at night, or can you remember her things that she would say?
Something that you would say that, because towards the end with my mom, she had also terrible dreams, terrible. And she would spend the weekends with us. During the week, she was in her own apartment with help towards the end. And on weekends, she was with us. And sometimes I would hear her cry, and I would get into bed with her. And I would hold her just the way she used to hold me.
Oh, God.
Yeah. And it helped.
I'm sure.
I'm sure it helped her.
Yeah, I get that. Towards the end in the camp, you suffered a terrible accident. Could have killed you. Talk about the leg and the burn.
Yeah. Well, it was one day that my mother decided that she would smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked, and using somehow an empty can as a pot. Where she got that, I don't know, but she did. Pure strong will. And she used pieces from the wooden slats from our bunk for firewood. My mother somehow, how she did it, I don't know, but she did manage to cook some soup in secret. And this was done on our bunk bed, and I was on the bunk with her trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards actually entered our barrack for a surprise inspection. And in our rush to hide the setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. Now, we had been taught self-discipline and self-control in so many ways, and I knew that it would cost us our lives if I were to cry out. This happened in the spring of 1945, and I was just 10 years old. And that was it. And we lost the soup that night, but not our lives. Self-discipline
kept you alive. Kept you alive.
For sure.
1945, the tide of war finally was turning, and you could tell, I think you all in the camp could tell that things were changing. And finally, you and your mom and your brothers and your father, your brother and your father, you were shipped. However, like cattle in a train car. Right? Talk about
the population in Camp Bergen-Belsen was obviously dying off rapidly. Several weeks later, that trainloads of our people were sent to Eastern Europe, towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. And we did not know at that time that Auschwitz, with its gas chambers, had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. And by this time, it was April of 1945, and the Russians were closing from the northeast, British from the Americans from the west. And under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they would send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks, without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant there were no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered, I remember taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from a locomotive, and who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the terrible typhus that we all had. Typhus is a highly contagious, deadly disease, and it is caused from filth and spread by lice, and we were covered with lice. And at the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off, and they were buried along the tracks. And this train was Bergen-Belsen on wheels. It was a hell on wheels. In addition to that, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It's amazing, remarkable that any one of us survived. 500 of our people didn't. That's 1 out of every 5 died en route or shortly thereafter.
And then liberation.
Yeah, well, my leg was in bad condition. Couldn't keep it clean or lice-free. And yes, in late April, after 14 days, 2 weeks of this surreal, horrifying journey, the frantic German guards stormed through the train, and they were seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. I mean, that was ridiculous. We were in rags, but nevertheless, they were willing to wear rags just so they wouldn't be recognized. And it was then that we realized that the war was coming to an end. And in our case, it was the Russian army that liberated our train, and they led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. And there, many of the inhabitants fled, and we took over their homes. They really, particularly the women, fled because they were afraid of the Russian military army. Mm-hmm. And in this village, the kitchens were amply stocked with wonderful food. It was rich and good, and of course, much, much too good for our starved bodies. We couldn't tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And it was at that time that I weighed 16 kilos or 35 pounds at the age of 10 and a half, and my mom weighed a mere 70 pounds. And the Russian tried the best they could to help us along, and I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention, and I was very, very lucky that they were willing to treat the wound, and I was so fortunate that my leg responded to medication and it gradually healed. And they used the precursor of penicillin. They used sulfur to sprinkle on the leg. Yellow, to this day, I can see it. Why they chose to help me that way, I have no idea. My mother was too ill. My father was already almost gone. And why they helped me and took me to the clinic, I looked like, we were such a mess. I was such a scrawny thing. But they helped me every day. They came to pick me up and took me to the clinic. And they sprinkled this sulfur on it. And here we had nothing to fall back on. We were so undernourished. And yet it healed little by little. Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think of that farm villages, did things turn back into color yet, or did that take time?
Yes. Yes. No one has ever mentioned that. Yes.
Yeah.
Even though we were all weak and ill and exhausted, the weather was beautiful, sunny and bright, and the trees and grass were lush and green, and flowers were in bloom. I never even thought of that. You're right.
I can imagine. I have tears in my eyes because I can really...
Oh, my goodness.
I can understand.
I never thought that's when the color came back into my life.
Yeah.
The beauty came back into my life.
And nature can be such a wonderful healer.
Even though we were still so sick.
Sure.
And even though we were sick with typhus, and my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation.
That's the part that I would have been heartbroken to survive and then to lose him.
It was terrible, terrible, terrible. And my brother helped bury our father. He was only 12 years old. He was the only one who was strong enough to attend and to be there. And that left my mother, Hallie, at the age of 37, a widow, 2 sick children, and she herself was deathly sick with typhus, no money, no home, and no country, not knowing what the future would bring.
You wind up back in Holland.
Yeah. It really is a wonderful story how we gradually recuperated and was sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. And it was my brother and I who were eventually placed in a children's home in a town called Bussum, just a little bit an hour south of Amsterdam. And we were in this home in preparation to live in what was then British-controlled Palestine. And we know now today as Israel. And most of the children in his home survived alone without their parents. And at that time, I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society. I had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old. I had never been in a store, no idea what money was all about. I had no table manners. It really was like learning to live all over again. And it was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. And meals were always delicious. Everything tasted good to us. And to this day, everything tastes good. Just don't give me turnips. And never turnips. Never turnips.
That was the soup stuff, right?
I won't eat them.
Yeah.
And I began, the surrogate parents we had in that home, it was Mr. and Mrs. Birnbaum, and they survived with their 6 children.
Wow.
All 6 children, and the parents survived. And 3 of their 6 children had polio in the camp.
Oh, my gosh.
Were in isolation and recuperated.
Where was your mom during this time? I'm confused a little.
She was in Amsterdam, and we were in this little town called Bussum. And she had to also recuperate.
Okay.
And she somehow was able to find my aunt, my father's sister, who was in hiding in Holland. And they somehow connected. I don't know how that came about, but they did. And they shared an apartment in Amsterdam. My mother went to learn to be a masseuse and a manicurist and pedicurist. And she was able to there was a Jewish community somehow. This was already, a year or so later, that they were able to help somewhat. So my mother learned to be a masseuse and a manicurist. They were able to help her to get a used bicycle, and she went from customer or client to client on a bicycle, and she would earn a few Holden. Holden is equivalent to $1. And that's how she
got
survived.
Back on her feet. And she got back on her feet.
Yeah.
If I should lose my precious stones, my secret hiding place will reveal more perfect pebbles far beneath these barracks made of wood and steel.
Ultimately, and I love this part of the story, ultimately you wind up being able to go to the States, which had been where you had started to, in the beginning. Holland America line, talk to me about that, because that's just beautiful.
Well, first of all, we started our education in Holland in Dutch, okay? And that was a new language for us. We also learned Hebrew because we were with the intentions of emigrating to what was then still Palestine. And so we had to learn Hebrew. And at that time, parents were not allowed to accompany their children. So my mother wouldn't let us go without her to Palestine. No way. So she then made arrangements for us to come to the United States. And yes, this is amazing. Thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier.
Oh, my
Amazing.
gosh, right?
This was, and there we arrived in New Jersey, Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948. By coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. So my mom said, no, she wouldn't let us go alone. We were going to go to America, and that was it. And how she was able to obtain those tickets, I don't know. We never really talked about it. I have no idea how she got that, but she did. She must have been told by someone, take a look and see. After all, Europeans, the Germans in particular, but even the Dutch, I guess, are good record keepers. And they were able to find our passage and from others too, not just ours. And they honored them.
I love that.
And it was a Hebrew immigration aid. And we arrived to April 23rd, which by coincidence was exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. That's when we came to America. April 23rd, 1948. Amazing.
I grew up right up the road from Hoboken, by the way, so just so you know. But not in Peoria, Illinois, which is where you landed, which is so funny.
It was that's the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. They found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. And as I said, I never heard of Illinois at that time, and definitely not Peoria. And at the age of 13, by this time I was 13 years old, I once again started life anew in a strange land, and again learning a new language, my third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the 4th grade with 9-year-olds. And both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, but I nevertheless found time, definitely made time to take extra courses, attend summer school, and work very hard in my studies. I was able to be graduated from Peoria High School 5 years later, at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students.
I love that story.
Yeah, and the kids know how to, students need to hear this, that one can overcome if you really, 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 really work at it, if you really, really will it. I mean, there I was. I worked after school. I sold house dresses, $1.57 each, 2 for $3. I babysat. I worked in a hot laundry. I worked split shift. I had to go back and forth, which wore out my soles of my shoes. I had to go get new soles for them. I mean, because we didn't have money to take a bus. And it was a struggle, major, major struggle. And it was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan.
I love that.
Who I had met in Peoria at age 16 on the holiday of Yom Kippur in the synagogue. Interesting.
You have 3 kids. How many grandchildren? How many great-grandchildren?
And first of all, we're, God willing, will, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be celebrating our 64th wedding anniversary in August. And I'm so grateful that I survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with Nathaniel, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. And yes, we have 3 grown children, all are happily married. They've given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 3 extraordinary, beautiful great-granddaughters. One was just a month old on Tuesday.
I love this. See, I love it.
Amazing.
So let me go back and just bring a few more points up before we close. And one is this. You still have in your possession the yellow star the Nazis forced you and all Jews to wear to shame you. Right. And I want to say this to you, as if being one of the chosen people, of which I am one too, is something to be ashamed of. What does that star mean to you now? And you didn't really speak to great length in this, but I'm curious. Your belief in God? Why was your faith not... Okay, let's talk about that just briefly, because I really need to know this. I want to know how one deals with something after a horror like that.
Okay. You know, our man upstairs, God, gives us a wonderful mind. Really, a wonderful mind. And it's this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. We are capable of making choices. Therefore, men did this to one another. Yet, on the other hand, Hallie, why did he have to make it so bitter cold when we were standing out there in a Pell all day? If he could split the Red Sea, why couldn't he help us a little bit more and have us liberated a little bit earlier so many more of our people would have survived, could have survived? So I have these tumultuous feelings with me. On one hand, people did this to one another, no doubt. And on the other hand, why couldn't he have come to our rescue a little bit sooner in some way? So that I have these tumultuous feelings within me. And then, on the other hand, he must have been crying also when he saw that what his children, we're all his children, what his children were doing to one another. So, it's a little bit of this, and it's a little bit of that.
And you're okay without being able to reconcile that. In other words, you know that the pendulum's going to go one to the other, one to the other. And
that's correct.
And that's
correct.
That's just the way that it is going to be.
That's okay.
All right. I really want to...
Because it's not all his doing. It's not his doing. Although he should be able to do anything and everything that is the right thing to do. But yet, if he gives people free will, so the people do this to one another.
Right. Okay.
It's
a good answer. I mean, it's the only answer there is. I mean, it's your answer.
Those people who have complete faith, I envy them. They don't question. That's it. That's the way it was meant to be. Don't tell me it was the way it was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be that way. Impossible. But if that's what they feel, so be it. How can this be meant to be? 6 million of our people were murdered. 1.5 million children. We just came back from Alabama. Alabama has a population of just about 5 million. And as I heard me say, can you possibly imagine the entire population of Alabama wiped out plus another million? That's when they get it. Okay? So that wasn't meant to be. Impossible. So I don't know. I wrestle with this.
Well, some things, there are some times that there aren't answers to questions, and that's okay too.
That's why, that's the best way to look at it.
Yeah, I suspect.
But, anyone in the right mind questions, come on.
But you are,
go on.
But you are an observant Jew, and that's that.
We need to hold on to this to show them that they did not win.
Right.
Here we are. And we have 3 children. Our Floridians are conservative. They keep a kosher home, and they try to hold on as best they can, because in a little bit of Vero Beach is not so easy. We have children in Israel who are modern Orthodox. We have children here in our area who are very Orthodox. Very, very. Okay? So we've got them on all levels.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one other question? That's about your brother.
Mm-hmm.
How did he handle all of this?
He deals with it altogether differently than I do. He will not talk about it as freely as you heard it from me. Lives in California. He is happily married right now. He's really, really suffering from Parkinson's, so he's in the assisted living. I just spoke with him this morning, and he by choice has no children and has a very difficult time with organized religion. All of this makes me very sad, but I do not fault him. You have to remember he is 2 years older than I am, was with my father in men's section, and he experienced and saw things that I did not. No doubt about it. So for him, this is much, much more difficult. And I deal with this altogether differently.
You've returned to Germany. I want to talk about that because I'm watching that clock. We're a little over, but I'm going for it. You returned to Germany many times. And so here's a word I'm going to throw out. Forgiveness.
No way. Okay. I was just asked it the other day in Alabama. They wanted to know about forgiveness. I know that in many religions, I think the Catholic religion in particular, feels very strongly about forgiving and forgiveness. There is no way that I, Marion Blumenthal Lazan, can forgive those that were directly responsible for what was done to us. No way. But only those that were responsible. We do not generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. Mustn't do that. That's an important message. We have to be very careful before we fault a whole group of people. You just don't do that, because I talk about the righteous Gentiles, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. They would hide them in attics, and they were hidden in barns and farms. They were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they were also deported to camps and in many cases lost their lives. And it brings me to this message that we must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. Just to be kind and good and respectful towards one another is the basis for peace.
Right.
No doubt about it.
Right.
It's got to begin at home.
Absolutely.
And we must not follow a leader blindly without first searching our hearts and minds as to what the consequences might be. The students will hear me say it's not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. So many lessons to be learned. These lessons pertain to that dark period of our history and certainly apply to today's world situation and definitely to our own individual lives. I only hope that by listening, that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future.
I've been speaking with Holocaust survivor Marion Blumenthal Lazan. Marion travels the world to bear witness to the last generation of Holocaust survivors. Her memoir, FOUR PERFECT PEBBLES, is in its 12th printing and is taught in schools worldwide. Marion's triumph, Surviving History's Nightmare, is a truly unique Holocaust documentary as seen on PBS, narrated by Deborah Messing from Marion's point of view. For more information on Marion and her work, and for more information about John Holt, visit Marion Blumenthal Lazan's website at fourperfectpebbles.com.
My